So does the Lord try to test us? He does, but not in the way you probably think. Because when we hear that the Lord is trying to test us, we think the Lord is trying to get us, right, with a gotcha question. No, the Lord doesn't try to test us as in trip us up. He's not playing games with us. But he does try to evaluate, if you will, how much we're paying attention to life. And dare I say, how much we're paying attention to him. And so sometimes it may feel like the Lord is interrogating us to see whether or not we have been paying attention to everything he's tried to reveal to us thus far. So in that regard, yes, he does try to test us. But mind you, he has already given us all the answers. Today we find ourselves on the 5th Sunday of Lent. And we are in cycle A. So we just finished 3 weeks of what's called the scrutinies. If you recall, 2 weeks ago, the gospel reading was, anyone remember? The woman at the well. There you go. The woman at the well. And then last week's gospel was the man born blind. And today's gospel is the raising of Lazarus. Each of these 3 gospels are referred to as the scrutinies. And when we're being, quote, scrutinized, isn't that a means of evaluation? And when you read these 3 gospels, you see our Lord literally interrogating them or scrutinizing them to see whether or not they have been paying attention the entire time. Our Lord enters into dialogue with them. If you can't, and let's say you have a Bible with Jesus' words in red, I really want you, and this will be for your benefit, I really want you to go back and reread the gospel of the woman at the well, the man born blind, and today's gospel. And I want you to pay attention to the dialogues. The dialogues are very important. Jesus is speaking an awful lot. And if you ever want to know what it's like for Jesus to speak to you, well, maybe it's good to look back on how he is speaking to these people. Because he is evaluating whether or not they have been paying attention the entire time. And so quickly to refresh you to the woman at the well, remember our Lord goes to the well and he sees this woman there, and it's the middle of the day. She's obviously there because she's avoiding someone, avoiding the other ladies. And Jesus is there and he starts to talk about this imagery of water, about how it is life-giving and how it can quench and how it can cleanse. And this woman, filled with carnal desires of having slept with man after man after man, doesn't seem to understand what our Lord's trying to say. And so he has to change his approach. He becomes an awful lot more blunt. And in the privacy of a one-on-one conversation, he bluntly asks her, "Go call your husband." What's the answer to that? She does not have a husband. Why? Because she's had 5 husbands, and the man that she's currently living with now is not her husband. So our Lord has to become much more blunt with her to get her attention. But if you read the beginning of the dialogue, Jesus was telling her everything she needed to know in the beginning. Today we get to the raising of Lazarus. And if you pay attention to how it unfolded today, it kind of unfolds like a good sitcom. You see a lot of big personalities in today's gospel. Personalities that, we can relate to. And Jesus is very much in charge of what's going on here. And he's trying to talk with these people. There's an awful lot of dialogue. But guess what? They just don't seem to be paying attention. So let's go through some of these dialogues and see how our Lord is interrogating them. So, Jesus gets word that his friend Lazarus, who he clearly states that he loves very much, is dead. And so our Lord, kind of like how he went to the woman at the well, speaks to them in veiled language. And he tells his disciples, our friend Lazarus is asleep, and I am going to awaken him. Them being rather hard-headed, don't understand what he's talking about. They think that he is referring to the fact that Lazarus is just simply asleep, in ordinary sleep. And so our Lord has to be a little more blunt. And he just bluntly says, Lazarus is dead. And you know what? I am glad. It says, I am glad that he is dead. For you, that I was not there, so that you may come to belief. And then guess we see the first person in a speaking role. We meet Thomas. And what's Thomas's nickname? Doubting Thomas. Remember, he's a negative Nancy, always expecting rain on the day of the party. And when he hears that Lazarus, the guy who Jesus claims to love, is dead, and Jesus just said, I'm glad that he's dead. You know what Lazarus says? In a cynical, doubting way? Well, let us go die with him. If that's how he treats Lazarus, how do you think he's going to treat us? He's been dead. And he waited 2 days to even go and do anything. And so, obviously, Jesus, probably not sinning, but gets a little frustrated and says, fine, let us go to Bethany. And so they go to Lazarus, and they go to Bethany, and Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days. And now, Jesus has to encounter another character with a big personality. We see Martha. And Martha is obviously the sister of Mary and Lazarus. And Martha's got a big personality. She is a hard worker. She is a busy bee. She obviously wears the pants in the family, and she probably has kind of a short fuse. And so when she hears that Jesus is coming, she marches up to him and kind of tells him off and says, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. She starts to accuse the Lord of not caring. And our Lord says, okay, first off, I am the resurrection. And he's probably thinking to himself, I have been friends with you now for like 3 years. And you haven't figured that out? I am the resurrection. And then he tells her, you know what? Your brother will rise. And Martha says to him, I know he will rise. And then Jesus tells her again, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then he asks her point blank, do you believe this? Do you? And I always love her answer. It's, yes, Lord, comma, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. She realizes that it's not just something that happens instantly. And then I think we catch Martha in a lie. And so the gospel says she went to call her sister Mary secretly. She went and called her sister Mary secretly. Now, as I've probably said before, I really believe that Mary, the sister of Martha, is Mary Magdalene, okay? This is important. Because what was Mary Magdalene's profession? She was a prostitute. So she had her own baggage of sins. She's got her own big personality. And so Mary goes in secret to her sister and says, the teacher is here, and he is asking for you. Did Jesus ask for Mary at all? No, he doesn't. And so Mary, thinks, the Lord's asking for me. So Mary Magdalene goes up to Jesus. And what does she do? She does what she does best. She starts to weep. And she says the exact same line that her sister Martha did. But instead of being all riled up, She is weeping. And what does she say? Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And then the gospel says, Jesus saw her weeping, and he became perturbed and deeply troubled, and said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Sir, come and see. And when he sees for himself, we see the emotion of Jesus. We see Jesus' own personality come out. And what does Jesus do? He weeps. And they said, see how he loved him. And then everyone starts to doubt. See, this guy loved him. But as we just read last week, isn't the guy who made the blind man see, shouldn't he have been able to do something to have prevent all of this? And again, Jesus' personality comes out. John clearly states that Jesus was perturbed yet again and went to the tomb. And he said in a command, he said as an imperative, take away the stone. And Martha, the dead man's sister, remind you, she's always wound up like an 8-day clock, worrying about what's going to happen, opens her mouth and says, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. Surely there'll be a stench. And Jesus says to her, did I not just tell you, like a paragraph ago? Did I not just tell you that if you will believe, you will see the glory of God? And he yells, take away the stone. And he says, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, wrapped in burial bands. And we see our Lord's final miracle leading up to his own resurrection, bringing Lazarus back from the dead. In John's gospel, this is the capstone miracle. It's a precursor to his own resurrection. And yet leading up to it, guess what we see? An array of personalities, all of which are worried about other things and completely forget everything that our Lord has already told them. Yes, our Lord scrutinizes them, but the questions that he poses to them and the dialogues that he enters into with them, he's talking to them about stuff that he's already revealed to them. And yet it is their own self that seems to get in the way. About a year ago, I went on a retreat to St. Meinrad's in Indiana. It was a Benedictine monastery. And I had a spiritual director there. And we started talking about, the saints and stuff. And he asked me what my devotions were. And I said, well, I really like Peter, I really like Martha, and I really like Mary Magdalene. And he just grinned at me and he said, you know why you like them? It's because you can relate to them. And you know why you can relate to them? You relate to them through their sin. Maybe a little true. But you see these big personalities. They're just like us. And guess what letters they have in front of their name? S and a T. We can relate to them. And believe me, just like the woman at the well who had her 6 husbands, they too needed to be scrutinized. And if you want to see what it's like to have a dialogue with the Lord, pay attention to these readings. They're obviously preparing us for something. They're preparing us to be redeemed. They're preparing us for the resurrection. In fact, he's preparing us so much for the resurrection that what is the miracle that he does here? Brings someone back from the dead. He resuscitates. And our Lord is out to resuscitate us. The person who doesn't speak is a Lazarus. And yet, in some ways, we are the most like Lazarus. Although he was physically dead, for some of us, we may be more spiritually dead than we want to admit. And our Lord needs to yell at us and say, come out. And God willing, between now and the resurrection, we too will come out wrapped in our burial bands.